Welcome to Live Without Limits. Transform your thinking to redesign your life. I'm your host, Davida Shensky, and today we're diving into the topic that affects every community, whether we acknowledge it or not: discrimination. Discrimination isn't just one person treating another unfairly, it's a seed that once planted grows into something much bigger: resentment, division, and even hatred. That hatred can spread like wildfire, creating barriers between people and destroying trust in communities. But here's what's important to remember: just as hatred is learned, so is love. We can break the cycle, but it takes awareness, effort, and a willingness to see things differently. So, in this episode, I'll walk you through how discriminate perpetuates hatred, the emotional and social impact it leaves behind, the mindset shifts needed to stop it, and the most important practical steps you can take to be part of the change. So let's get started. Understanding the cycle of discrimination. Discrimination shows up in many forms: race, religion, gender, ability, class, and more. Sometimes it's blatant, like refusing to hire someone because of their background. Other times it's subtle, like dismissing someone's opinion because of their accent, or assuming they're less capable because of a disability. The harm isn't limited to that single act. When someone is discriminated against, it creates pain and frustration. Over time, the pain can turn into anger, not just toward the person or the group who is discriminated against, but towards the entire system or society. And when the entire groups of people feel marginalized, a cycle begins. The targeted individuals start distrusting others, communities pull apart, and hatred grows, sometimes passed down from generation to generation. History gives us countless examples: segregation in the United States, anti Semitism in Europe, gender inequality worldwide, and all of these show us how discrimination, when left unchecked, festers into systematic hatred. The sad truth: unless we interrupt, the cycle continues. Here are real world examples of how discrimination and hatred can feed into violent acts, some of them assassination or attempted assassination, and how the perpetuation of othering or dehumanization plays a role. Use the sensitivity in your with a heavy but important illustration. So here are some examples of what we're talking about when we're talking about discrimination. And I really want to emphasize that some of these things are things that you've seen and heard about. And we all know about the Charlie Kirk assassination. But Charlie Kirk happens to be a conservative activist. And although investigations are still ongoing, the killing is widely viewed as publicly motivated and fueled by polarized rhetoric. Experts warn of a vicious spiral in political violence when extreme rhetoric devalues opponents. It can push someone to see assassination as justified. The suspect, Tyler Robinson, was arrested for aggravated murder. The event has inflamed national discourse in political violence and hate. Wadya was killed, his mother seriously wounded. Now, let's look at Wadya, a 6-year-old Palestinian American. The attack was explicitly motivated by anti-Muslim Islamic phobia hatred that the attacker yelled. Wadya was killed. Okay. His mother seriously wounded. Now, let's look at who was targeted and why. The boy and his mother. Muslims must die. This is a direct, violent outgrowth of discriminative dehumanization. The perpetuator was convicted on hate crime charges and sentenced to 53 years. Carlton was fatally... Okay, now, let's now talk about Laura Carlton, LBGT plus store owner. The suspected killer made disparaging comments about her displaying a pride flag, involved anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, and shot her. This is a direct example of targeting someone because of identity. Carlton was fatally shot. The suspect was later killed in a confrontation with police. The crime is under investigation as a hate crime. Now, let's look at the Annapolis shooting in 2023. Latino neighbors, Hispanic victims, prosecutors have filed hate crime charges citing evidence that the 3 people who were killed, others injured. Now, let's look at why discrimination and hatred played a role in the outcome of the impact. So, let's go back up to the Latino neighbors. That the evidence that the shooter made racial slurs and that the tensions over Hispanic neighbors had been present. 3 people were killed, others injured. The case is advancing with hate crime charges. Okay. People at or near the mosque. This is the mosque stabbing attempt in 2024 Turkey. The attacker was a self-described national socialist influenced by extreme ideologies, and his manifesto statement included dehumanizing language. The case is, multiple people were stabbed, non-fatal, attacker was detained. He faced serious discrimination charges. Now, let's look at what happened in 2022 at the Oslo Pride shooting. This was the LGBTQ community during events. The shooting occurred at venues connected to Pride. The motive was tied to anti-LGBT sentiment and possibly Islamic extremism targeting queer people. 2 people died, many wounded. The attacker was convicted and sentenced. So, those were some examples, but some of the common ones that we remember was what happened in Germany under Hitler and how he targeted the Jews and anti-Semitism. For many years, anti-Semitism seemed to have gone away, but it never really went away. And we're seeing it rise now in the way and bombings are taking place in other situations. So how the perpetuation of discrimination makes violence more likely. Looking across these and other instances, you can see several patterns, ways that discrimination or hatred creates fertile ground for violence or assassination, dehumanizing language, framing when a group is repeatedly discriminated or is less than human, a threat, or other. It belongs to psychologically easier to someone to justify violence. A murderer who chants, "You Muslims must die," is removing the target's humanity. Now, let's talk about how words matter, because once the identity becomes the entity, violence is just the next step for someone. Normalized hatred in media, politics, social discourse. If newspapers, social media, political leaders, or influencers regularly use divisive, hostile us versus them language, even tacitly, that helps lower the barrier to violent behavior. Polarized rhetoric can amplify resentment and push unstable individuals towards action. And this can be seen in the Kirk case. The thing is, Charlie Kirk would go around dehumanizing people, and then what he would do is he would go and to the colleges and he would talk this rhetoric of hatred, whether it be against women and education, blacks and employment. And a lot of this was his own fears. So what we need to look at is emphasize the role of the tone, the platform, and what's said openly in creating what feels acceptable. So the echo chambers and radicalization, isolated online spaces, forums, chat rooms, extremist media allow hateful ideas to intensify unchecked. People confirm each other's worst biases, harden views, and eventually talk about violence as a solution. Now, we've been seeing this go on, and if you remember, in Russia, the state media, they control what someone hears. And you're starting to see that in the media today, and who's buying out the different networks and how they're changing the message that they're giving out. And instead of giving both sides, they are very much becoming polarized in what they're saying. So lack of accountability or weak pushback when discriminatory remarks or actions aren't confronted, or when justice systems fail to prosecute hate crimes properly, it signals that violence against these groups has low risk. Some hate crimes go unprosecuted or with minimal consequences, emboldening others. The silent tolerance around discrimination is part of the pipeline to violence. Fear based identity, threats, and scapegoating. While economic or social stressors arise, pandemics, or rather, pandemics, immigration concerns, political shifts, and we're seeing the political shifts going on more and more right now. People look for scapegoats. Discriminatory narratives provide someone to blame. Then halted, hatred, and violence are cast as defensive rather than aggressive. During the COVID-19 anti-Asian rhetoric spiked as people blamed Asians for the virus. Connect how the societal stress and identity narratives equal danger. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to get into this is very much because discrimination has gone on for centuries. It's never changed, and it probably will never change. But how education and learning about different groups, learning about their cultures, learning about their beliefs is one way of reducing some of that hatred. Let's look deeper at the impact. Discrimination is not just about unfair treatment. It cuts to a person's identity. It tells them, you're less than, you don't belong, you're not enough. This kind of wound runs deep. Some people internalize it, leading to shame, low self-esteem, or even self-hatred. Others externalize it, lashing out in anger or resentment. On the other side, people who discriminate often set out from fear and insecurity. Fear is what they don't understand. Fear of losing power or privilege. And when fear drives behavior, it rarely leads to compassion. Then there's the social piece, stereotypes reinforced by media, jokes that normalize bias, institutions that fail to protect, marginalized groups. All of this creates an environment where hatred doesn't just survive, it thrives. And so the discrimination doesn't just affect the person being targeted. It affects all of us. It divides communities, fuels conflict, and erodes the trust we need to move forward together. You've touched on the mechanisms that quietly keep discrimination alive, even when people think they're just making a joke or following tradition. So let me expand your thoughts into an explanation. Discrimination isn't always about loud or obvious. Sometimes it's woven into the very fabric of our everyday lives through social bonds, emotional cues, and institutional practices that go unquestioned. Here's how. The stereotypes are reinforced by media, movies, TV shows, music, and even advertising often rely on stock characters or one-dimensional portrayals of certain groups, for example, depicting immigrants as criminals, women as overly emotional, or people with disabilities as helpless. These portrayals shape perceptions subconsciously, teaching society to expect and accept distorted versions of reality, jokes that normalize bias. Humor can be a powerful connector, but it also can be a weapon when racist, sexist, homophobic, or ableist jokes or laughs, the signal that it's okay to reduce people to stereotypes. Over time, these jokes normalize bias, making harmful ideas seem harmless, when in reality, they chip away at dignity and belonging. Institutions that fail to protect, schools that overlook bullying, workplaces that ignore harassment, governments that pass unequal policies or fail to enforce protections. These failures send a message: your safety and equality aren't priorities. That emboldens predators and silences victims. The emotional bonds of group identity. Humans naturally want to belong, and belonging often comes to the cost of othering outsiders. When loyalty to one's group is built on mocking or exchanging another group or excluding another group, hatred becomes the glue that holds the identity together. This creates echo chambers where bias feels like normal behavior. All of this together, stereotypes, jokes, institutional neglect, and emotional bonds, builds an environment where hatred doesn't just survive, it thrives. It hides in plain sight, disguised as tradition, just humor, or the way things are. And when hatred feels normal, it becomes much easier for someone to take the next step into violence or open hostility. Now, how this fuels anti Semitism, which we are currently seeing on the rise again. Anti Semitism, hostility, or prejudice against Jewish people has been called the oldest hatred, and it's a powerful example of how stereotypes, bias, and systematic failures perpetuate discrimination. Stereotypes reinforced by culture and media. For centuries, Jewish people have been stereotyped as greedy, manipulative, or outsiders who don't belong. These stereotypes show up in books, films, political cartoons, and conspiracy theories, painting Jewish communities as threats rather than neighbors. Jokes and casual remarks, anti Semitic jokes about money, power, appearance may sound small, but they plant seeds of mistrust. They normalize prejudice in everyday conversation, making it easier for harsher hatred to take root. Institutional failures. History is filled with institutions, from governments to religious authorities, that not only failed to protect Jewish people, but actively prosecuted them. Programs in Europe, restrictions on jobs and housing, the Holocaust itself, all happened because institutions either enforced or ignored systematic hatred, conspiracy theories in times of crisis. During social and economic upheavals, Jewish people are often scapegoated. They control the banks, they cause the war, they're manipulating the media. These baseless conspiracies fuel resentment and justify violence. In modern times, anti Semitic tropes resurface online in memes, forums, and extremist spaces, spreading faster than ever. Anti Semitism shows us how discrimination can become self perpetuating, stereotypes repeated in media, casual jokes that normalize them, institutional that fail to challenge them, scapegoating during crisis, violence, and even assassination. That's why combating anti Semitism and all discrimination requires action at every level, calling out harmful jokes, demanding accountability from institutions to refusing to let conspiracy theories go unchanged. Now, here are some recent and historical examples of anti Semitic violence and a breakdown on how they illustrate the mechanisms by which discrimination, bias, and institutional failures lead to tragedy. Now, in 2025, Washington, D.C., the museum embassy staff shooting. A gunman opened fire outside the Capitol Jewish Museum at an event hosted by the American Jewish Committee. Two Israeli embassy staff, Yaron Leshensky and Sarah Milgram, were killed. The suspect was heard chanting, "Free Palestine," and later pulled out a kafia and said, "I did it for Palestine, Gaza." The Department of Justice has charged him with federal hate crime and murder of foreign officials. This attack underscores that when political conflict overlaps with identity, anti-Semitic hate can convert anger or ideology in violence. Now, the good news is that cycles can be broken, but it starts with the mindset. The first shift to empathy. Empathy means taking the time to step into someone else's shoes, even if you're never fully live live their experience. It means listening, not to respond, but to understand. The second shift is education. Bias often grows in the soil of ignorance. When we learn about other cultures, histories, and experiences, we see people as individuals rather than stereotypes. The third shift is dialogue. We need to create safe spaces where people can share their stories without fear of dismissal or attack. When conversations happen, walls begin to come down. We need role models, leaders who demonstrate what it looks like to turn conflict into collaboration. Think about figures like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., or Malala Yousafzai. They remind us that change begins with courage and vision. These shifts don't erase discrimination overnight, but they plant new seeds, seeds of connection, compassion, and hope. Now we need to break the cycle of hate and lessons from real events. Challenge stereotypes in media and culture. Why? Anti-Semitic portrayals and conspiracy tropes fueled many of the violent acts we saw. Demand better representation in film, books, and news. Support creators who humanize Jewish voices instead of reducing them to caricatures. Share accurate history and personal stories to replace harmful myths. Interrupt casual jokes and comments because jokes about money, power, or identity may seem harmless, but they desensitize listeners and normalize bias, strengthen institutions and accountability. In several cases, attackers were on the radar of authorities, but red flags weren't acted on, or communities lacked security, support. Institutional failures embolden hate. Break the echo chambers. Many attackers were radicalized online, where anti-Semitic conspiracies are reinforced. Without challenge, echo chambers accelerate hate into violence. Scapegoating awareness during crises. Historically, Jewish people and other minorities are blamed during times of economic or political crisis. That is scapegoating, and it feeds hatred and justifies violence. Now, how religious beliefs play into discrimination, us versus them thinking. Many religions teach strong community identity. While this builds belonging, it can also create an in-group versus out-group mindset. Historical prejudice rooted in belief. Religious texts or tradition have sometimes been interpreted as ways to justify discrimination against women, LGBTQ people, or people of other faiths. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Christian persecution have all at different times been fueled by religious rhetoric. Now, here's the flip side. It's important to note that the same beliefs that are used to exclude can also be used to heal. Most major religions teach compassion, justice, and the dignity of all people. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rabbi Abraham Joshua Herschel, and Malala used their faith as a foundation for fighting discrimination and violence. Interfaith dialogue shows how religion can bridge divides, not deepen them. Now, let's wrap this up. Discrimination perpetuates hatred, but it doesn't have to. Every single one of us has the power to interpret the cycle through empathy, education, dialogue, and action. So I want to leave you with this question. What small act can you take this week to replace division with understanding? Because in the end, hatred is learned, but so is love. The choice to teach one over the other begins with us. And one thing I can tell you is this, that hatred is often perpetuated through generations simply because families tend to espouse that hatred. The children learn to perpetuate the hatred only until there's a break in that rhetoric. Will there ever be a change and get to the point where people will accept each other for who they are and be willing to live together and get along at all times?